The Gorequeen's Raiders. In 2398 IC. Blood for the Blood God. The traditional cornet battle cry. The Norscan tribes have ever been the bane of the Empire's northernmost provinces. Since even before the Age of Sigmar, they have raided and ravaged the northern shores, burning and plundering the villages of the oft-beleaguered Nordlanders. In 2398 IC, Falkia, the Gorequeen, and Shield Maiden of Khorne came upon her fellow Norsemen and sounded the call to make war once again upon the people of Nordland. By her murderous will, the tribes of NORSCA fell upon the Empire, their only desire to slaughter for the glory of the Blood God. Neither man, nor woman, nor child, nor even chattel would be spared sacrifice to the god of war. Zaltzenmund did not spare soldiers to defend the northern marches from the Norscan invasion. The villagers were forced to look to their own defences, led by a brave fisherman known as Harald Dreidsacker, who gathered a ragtag fleet to patrol the Sea of Claws, ever anxious for the sight of the Norscan's blood-red sails on the horizon. As Geheimnistag came and cold winds began blowing, the people of Nordland let out a collective shudder of relief. For the break of winter marks the end of the Norscan raiding season. The Nordlanders thus turned their efforts to the long process of rebuilding. But barely 3 days after the first breaking of winter, the Norscans returned to play out their last acts of brutality and carnage. The Gorequeen and her Huskarls fell upon the city of Dietershafen, and great was the slaughter they brutally unleashed. The Norscans massacring the inhabitants with vicious abandon. Harold quickly marshalled his ships to intercept the raiders at anchor, but with a single throw of Slopnir, Falkia smashed their entire fleet to bloody kindling. All was thought lost, and had it not been for the timely arrival of a steel-clad dwarven dreadnought, all spewing steam and cannon fire, the end would have surely been in sight for the province of Nordland. It is not known what drew the ship or its hardy dwarven crewmen, but whatever the case, it must have surely settled a mighty grudge, for the dwarven mariners were able to drive back the Norscan raiders, routing their longships back to NORSCA. The people of Nordland had further cause to rejoice when it was found that Harald Dreidsacker had narrowly survived the sinking of his ship and washed ashore on Nordland's coasts. Though the Norscan fleet was routed, there was little to no sign of the Gorequeen herself, whether it was the sight of her wolf ship sailing to safety or that of her demonic corpse. The favoured consort of the dreaded Norscan god of war. It is said in the sagas of the Norse tribes that the blood god himself saw fit to bring Falkia back from death, and remade her anew with the gift of demonhood. The Lord of Battles is thus loath to allow this favoured servant to fall, for it is Falkia who is said to choose the slain warriors of the north to be reborn again in the halls of Khorne, that they might fight on in glorious battle for all eternity. thereby peopling Khorne's malignant realm with warriors to carry on the eternal war he so adores. Khorne's winged servant is thus well known to all warriors of the north, and so the ferocity of such barbarian warriors is heightened and bolstered even further by her presence. For to live forever in the halls of the blood god is an honor beyond all others. History would later prove that the Gorequeen survived this battle, and so it was that the outcome of the invasion was naught but a Pyrrhic victory for the Empire. For while the people of Nordland did their utmost best to prepare for the coming winter, many hundreds of strong working men had been slaughtered by the Norskans during the raids, and the northern marauders had also burned many storehouses and fields. Necessity thus drove the courageous Harald to make the journey southwards to Zaltzenmund, in order to beseech the nobility to provide for their beleaguered subjects. However, he never returned from his journey. Some say he was slain by spies of the vengeful Norsemen, while others clamour with angry voices that he was assassinated by the agents of the nobles who felt threatened by the fisherman's rising clout. Regardless, with Harald's death, no aid came south from Zaltzenmund, meaning that only the hardiest folk of this harsh province survived the winter of 2398. In addition to the massive devastation the Norse warriors had wreaked upon Nordland, their coming had also sown the seeds of dissension and rebellion in the hearts of the commoners towards the nobility. In the aftermath of the raids and Harald's mysterious demise, certain groups began forming with the intent to overthrow the nobility, citing their indifference during the Norse raids and general corruption as reasons they had to be brought low. These events inflamed the already great civil unrest within Nordland, and brought the province that much closer to an inevitable civil war. Khorne, more so than his fellow Chaos Gods, is said to take particular pleasure in anarchy and disorder, as such occurrences intensify the prospects of battle and bloodshed. It is thus thought by some that the Norskans alone of all the parties of this conflict were the true victors. For Khorne cares not from whence blood flows, and so neither do his followers. The Battle of Nordland Fjord. In 2502 IC. Shortly after the coronation of the Reichland prince, Karl Franz, to the position of emperor, Norse tribes once again gathered for a great raid upon the soft lands of the south. Led by preeminent warlords of the far north, among whom was Gutrod Spoom, Jarl of the Dragonbone tribe and champion of Nurgle. Never an idle man, the Emperor gathered his armies to aid Count Theodoric Gauser in repelling the warriors of Chaos. Initially, Karl Franz appeared to abandon his brother Count, leaving the beleaguered armies of Nordland to the fury of the demon-worshipping Norsi. But his apparent retreat had in fact been a clever ploy to gain the support of Zarina Katarine of Kislev. The Reichland prince had rescued the Kislevarin from the depredations of a Norscan marauder band that had waylaid her and her retinue several leagues away, and had carried her to the battlefield aloft upon his personal griffin Deathclaw. Zarina Katarin, a powerful practitioner of the native magics of her people, cast a spell that froze the Bay of Nordland in its entirety, preventing yet more Norscan wolfships from making landfall and reinforcing their kinsmen. The aid of the Ice Witch allowed the coward Karl Franz to engage the marauder warbands one by one, isolating the horde and driving the Norscan warriors from the Empire. No sooner than when his war machines reduced the Norscan wolfships to kindling had the Emperor taken his armies and returned back to Reichland in the far south, albeit leaving a company of his personal guard, the much-vaunted Knights of the Reichsguard, to aid Count Theodoric in the mop-up operation. The newly ascended Emperor had only intervened in the fighting in order to prove his strength to those electors who had spoken out and decried his taking of the throne. With the laurel of victory secured, the southern prince had no desire to remain in the north, and believed the Norsemen vanquished. A foolish belief. For the warriors of the north do not accept defeat willingly, and were readying themselves for another stand against their foes. Even more troubling, Guthrod Spume had survived the battle, and somehow found his way back to his tribe in NORSCA. Raging at his defeat at the Reichlanders' hands, Guthrod Spume made his oath before the Earth-Father Nurgle that he would one day return to the south and take his vengeance. At the Nordland coast, near the town of Hargendorf, Count Theodoric Gausa gathered a new army of levies to drive out the last of the Norscan tribes that yet remained of the once mighty horde vanquished by France, the Scaling clan. Amongst his forces was Kurt Helborg, then a preceptor of the Reichsguard, and a small contingent of Reichsguard brother knights. Helborg and his warriors had pleaded with the Count to pull back to the town of Hargendorf and draw the Norscans to a siege they could not hope to win, for their defensive position and the fragility of the winter ice made a direct assault upon them a most risky endeavour. The hot-headed Nordland ruler had dismissed the concerns of the Reichsguard, for he would not disgrace his ancestors and land by fleeing from the northern invaders. For centuries, the Nordlanders had fought the Norsemen, giving their lives against the ruinous tribes in order to defend the soft, southern states of the Empire. He would carry on the fight just as his predecessors had, but this would prove to be a terrible error. The Scaling tribesmen readied themselves into a shield wall, and had used the battered beams of their fell longships to construct a ruinous war altar to the Chaos Gods in order to catch a measure of their favour for the difficult battle ahead. Among their numbers were heavily armoured Chaos warriors, hulking, axe-wielding champions clad in arcane sets of ruinous plate, standing shoulder to shoulder with their lightly armoured fellow tribesmen. Though the Imperials had attempted to goad the Norscans from their fortified position into a frontal charge, they had proved far more disciplined than expected, and merely kept their calm with their backs to the sea and the Emperor's army marching towards them. The archers and crossbowmen could not hope to pierce their heavy darkwood shields, and so the Nordlanders were forced to advance, going on the offensive in order to drive the Norscans back to their foul longships. To meet them charged forth frenzied youngbloods, stripped to the waist and covered with woad, screaming oaths to the dark gods and hurling blackened axes and javelins that slammed into the advancing block of halberdiers, causing the first ranks to fall over dead in an instant. Shamans cowled in furs and leathers hurled forth bloated heads at the charging ranks of Nordlanders, the grisly projectiles breaking apart on contact and enveloping the enemy in a demonic mist that had men clawing out their own throats in horrifying agony. To force the scalings down the hill had taken the better part of an hour, the unexpected discipline of the Norse marauders winning out. For all the Norscans' valour, however, they were too few, and Gausa's army began to win out with its greater numbers. The shield wall slowly disintegrated as lightly armoured tribesmen fell and mighty champions fought desperately to close the gaps in the wall. Yet, nonetheless, the Norscans had still chosen their battlefield well, and just as the Nordlanders began to gain on the retreating scalings, the thin ice under their ranks had shattered under the weight of so many armoured warriors, ushering many a Nordlander to a watery grave. Within moments, the regiment became panicked and disorderly, while the scalings howled and hooted at their foes' predicament and went back on the offensive, quickly forcing the Nordlanders back down the hill over a carpet of their dead. Once more the shield wall opened, allowing the frenzied youngbloods to pour out and again slake their lust for violence upon the prone and cowering men. Their advantage of numbers stripped from them by the terrain. The Nordlanders were soundly defeated by the brutal Norsemen. The Reiksguard charged to salvage something from the situation, but their efforts proved futile. Though the shield lines of the scalings wavered at the charge of the heavy cavalry, they did not break, and the Norse began to push back, as their massive axes and hammers smashed the knights from their saddles. However, the second charge of the knights finally broke the shield wall and drove the Norscans back. Yet, despite this, there was still no victory. The scaling horde began to pull back into the bog over a field of Nordlander dead, even while groups of marauders were already forming on the flanks of the Reiksguard. The knights could not hold the centre, and the day was lost. 200 Nordland soldiers and 1 Reiksguard knight were amongst the casualties the Nordland army suffered in their ill-fated attempt to drive the scaling warband from their shores. Thus it was Count Theodoric was forced to pull back his army in defeat back to the town of Hagendorf. Thus were the scalings victorious.
Lord Mortkin's invasion of Ostland
in 2515 IC. They came out of the north, bringing with them fire and ruin. Not since the great war against chaos had the Empire seen so furious an invasion from the barbarian worshippers of the dark gods. Is this war a madman's quest for revenge, or is it the beginning of the end? Anonymous. The Norscans, being fearsome barbarians born of the Shadowlands, are most feared and reviled for their monstrous faith, and the sheer bloody-minded fanaticism with which they carry the warlike banner of chaos. Indeed, whenever the shadow of chaos extends from out of the blasted wastes, the Norse are among the first to heed the will of the gods and leave their homes in force, sweeping into the southern lands, killing all before them and burning that which they cannot loot, during which many great champions step forward to command the armies of the north. Among the greatest of these warriors was the Norse warlord Lord Mortkin, who in 2515 IC led a chaos horde of terrifying power in order to ravage the entirety of the northeastern empire. So great was this army that it even rivaled the massive legions that had once marched at the command of the ever-chosen Asavar Kul. The chieftain of the horde, Mortkin himself, was a warlord perhaps even greater than Kul himself, a steel-clad jarl of numberless Norse tribes and lord of countless iron-sheathed champions of chaos. This Chaos Lord was the chosen vessel for the ruinous will of the Dark Gods, invested with their greatest blessings that he might carry out the doom of all civilization. Yet Mortkin cared little for such divine favor, for his greatest desire was but to slake his thirst for revenge upon the Ostlanders for the destruction Count Valmir von Raukov and his son had visited upon countless Norscan coastal villages. Many are the lords of chaos who seek the honor of carrying out the will of the gods when the realm of chaos waxes and a champion must be called. But some of the mightiest of these warrior kings did not join the clash. Archaon the Dark Templar had long strived on the path to becoming Chaos's greatest champion, but he was yet abroad with his swords of chaos, searching for the treasures of the dark gods, and so his fate was yet undecided. Quixiom, the two-headed sorcerer, had clothed himself in magical beguilement and sought tutelage from the demon-aided sorcerer lords of mighty Araby. Only Lord Mortkin, master amongst the red-handed reavers of the Chaos Wastes, was present to heed the demands of the gods, and even he was mired in a terrible gloom. For as news of the destruction of coastal villages spread across the northern wastes, so too did they reach the ears of the Black Iron Reaver. It was by fiendish chance that among the villages that had been put to the sword was the coastal town of Ulfenik, which was Mortkin's own birth village. So it was that numbering among the many savage oaths of vengeance and destruction that were preferred up to the northern powers was that of Mortkin himself, the Black Iron Reaver. The Chaos Lord had sealed himself within his mighty fortress in the deepest wilds of NORSCA, and there he raged. He swore to all the dark gods that his vengeance would be great, that the Southmen would reap the horrors they had sown, and that when all was said and done, he would claim his wergild from the blood and flesh of Oleg von Raukov. In that instance, the dark gods laid their greatest blessings upon Mortkin and raised him up as a dark avatar of their will. Pious in the ways of the Norse, Mortkin venerated each of the dark gods in equal measure. But he was ever his own man, ever looking after his own affairs, even before matters of faith. Though the gods were wary of investing their favour in a man who was so uncertain to carry out their will, none amongst their company doubted Mortkin's worthiness as a warrior and champion. For it was Mortkin who cast down the leprous council, a terrible cabal of matchless Nurglite sorcerers, single-handed. It was Mortkin who through cunning and will matched wits with the mighty dragon Skullex the Great, and bounded the ancient creature to his will. And it was Mortkin who overcame a mighty two-headed giant in an honest test of strength, and who earned the grudging respect of Khorne's shield maiden, Falkia the Bloody, when he fought her to a standstill in personal combat. With the pact made, when next the Chaos Lord stepped from his hall, it was with a single-minded purpose, to end the pointless bickering that had riven his people apart and lead the Norsemen to victory over the Empire once more. The attacks of 2515 IC were unlike anything seen in the Empire's recent memory. Encouraged by the rampant winds of chaos, an army of Norse tribes descended down across the Sea of Claws and put countless towns along the Nordland coast ablaze, though it was neither large nor bold enough to threaten the major cities further inland. Another, even larger host of Norskins then plunged southwards on a broad front through Kislev, causing a swath of destruction. Although much of the horde's momentum had dissipated on the endless steppe, some bands of marauders managed to slip past the defences of the Ostfords and wrought great havoc within the northeastern imperial province of Ostland. The third and most devastating of these preliminary attacks was led by the Slaneshi warlord Prince Sigvald the Magnificent. Sigvald's army of frenzied, debased raiders blazed through the lands of Kislev and Ostland in a 3-month rampage until it was finally blunted at the Temple of Skulls by a coalition of imperial armies that had marched north to Ostland's aid when Oleg von Raukov, ruling the state in his father's absence, sent forth an urgent plea for help. Regardless, these attacks were nothing more than a mere foreshadowing of the terror to come. The true and terrible heart of the invasion, the massive Norscan warband known as the Black Iron Reavers, the personal warhorde of Lord Mortkin himself, who stood at the mighty army's head, began marching from the depths of South NORSCA, intent on ravaging the lands of the Empire. A king of kings, favoured scion of chaos, and leader of many tribes, his was the mightiest army to cross the boundaries of the Empire for an age. Fear ran before Mortkin, and in his wake he left naught but smoking ruin and butchered offerings to the gods. Mortkin led his army from NORSCA, pushing south through Troll country until finally entering Kislev in the far south. Absorbing tribes of Norskins raiding from their holdings in the area, as well as newly materializing demons into their ranks, Mortkin's armies swelled to even greater proportions. The hordes first fell upon the nomadic horse tribes of the Ungolls, who, while able to keep on the move and avoid danger for a time, soon found themselves surrounded by discordant tribes of warriors so numerous that they were quickly hemmed on all sides and hacked apart. Keeping his army unified through iron will and aided by the whispered counsel of demons, Mortkin pushed ever onwards to Ostland, decimating everything in his path. Oleg von Raukov gathered his levies and the garrisons of the Ostforts and joined up with his long-time ally Pyotr Sergeyev, a Kovnik captain of Kislev and his company, intent upon meeting the NORSCAN armies on the northern side of the river Linsk and defeating them before they could penetrate into the empire itself. Mortkin's spearhead smashed Oleg von Raukov at the banks of the river Linsk and sent his battered army retreating back to the Ostforts. With this crushing defeat, the reckless heir to the Ostland throne finally realized that this was no mere warm-weather raid, but an invasion capable of wiping his home province off the map. Oleg von Raukov had further cause to fear, for during his father's war in the north, his had been the hand that had destroyed Mortkin's birth village of Ulfenik. So did rumors begin to surge throughout the remnants of the province that the Black Iron Reaver was searching specifically for the Ostland High Lord, putting blood-chilling fear into Oleg von Raukov's heart. In their search for the Ostland Prince, Mortkin's savage army wiped out the cities of Bosenfels, Zundap, and Klodberg from the face of Ostland. Klodberg specifically having been subjected to such a horrible end as to make even the hardiest soldiers of the Empire weep freely. It was Mortkin who tore down the ancestral seat of the von Raukov noble house, Castle von Raukov, destroying the venerable citadel and slaying all of Count Valmir's retainers. Even the Count's wife, Ivana von Raukov, was lost to the tender mercies of the Northmen when the castle fell. Oleg and his brother Vasily were able to escape the massacre, however, and flee southwards to the fortified city of Volganov, the most heavily defended fastness in all of Ostland. Upon hearing where the young lord had fled, Mortkin gathered the spearheads of his mighty army together and began a forced march to the imperial stronghold of Volganov. To the harsh blaring of war horns did Mortkin emerge from the massed ranks of his countrymen, flanked on either side by fell lieutenants. Such figures of might and power on their own could have wrought great devastation upon the lands of men, but here they were, subservient to this one northern king. Mounted atop his mighty juggernaut, a gift from the Norse blood god in thanks for many bounteous slaughters enacted, the massive, armoured form of the Norscan was wreathed in an aura of magic so blasphemous that to look upon him scarred an onlooker to his very soul. In an iron voice, the Northmen boomed his ultimatum to the cowering men of Volganov. "Surrender von Raukov to me, or I will crush your city. All of Volganov will die. I swear to the gods, your suffering will be great. You have a single day to decide your fate." Though it was tempting, given the massive numbers at the Chaos Lord's command, the Ostlanders refused to give up their beloved Count's son. "A wolf at the door is still a wolf," came the old Ostland saying, and the wolves of the north do not give up their sport. The next day, when Mortkin returned for Volganov's response, he was answered not by a human voice, but with the roar of cannon fire, and so the battle was joined. Mortkin raised his axe, flames coming alive across the blade. At this signal, the Norscan warbands plunged forth, black armored champions at their fore. At the southern wall, his demon host of carnate abominations fought with frenzied abandon to carry the battlements and take the city from the rear. At the same time, Mortkin held in check the matchless fury of his own fell legion, awaiting the right moment to strike. With the demon host's downfall and with his armored form now filled to bursting with dark energies, Mortkin finally took to the fray. At last, the Norscan king and his fell legion took to battle under tattered banners of black and red, and none could stand against them. The Crimson Reapers, the king's own Huskals, made quick work of all who stood in their way, hacking men apart with hideous ease with their mighty battle axes. And Lord Mortkin himself slew dozens with every swipe of his mighty axe. Realizing his counter-army was crumbling quickly under the fury of the Northerners, Oleg von Raukov could not keep his army from retreating back to the walls, and soon was left with only his own Scarlet Bull's great sword regiment to aid him on the battlefield. When Mortkin saw Oleg von Raukov on the field, death was in his gaze. With a roar, he slaughtered his way to meet the Ostlander in battle, leaving hundreds of bloody corpses in his wake. Though Oleg von Raukov was a mighty warrior, not even a hero as great as he had it within his power to defeat a beast such as Mortkin. 3 times did Oleg strike Mortkin, each blow which could have killed an ordinary man barely registered upon the hulking form of the Norse king. Having easily weathered the smaller man's desperate flurry of attacks, Mortkin lifted his axe and readied an assault of his own. With a blow that could have felled a giant, Lord Mortkin smote von Raukov, whose body crumbled almost to dust with the Norscan's blow. Although mortally wounded, the valiant man arose and attempted to fight on, but the cruel Norscan smashed him down to the ground with a single strike before proceeding to crush the life out of him with an iron heel. Though it would pass like all things, Mortkin would glut his savage soul upon Oleg von Raukov's suffering as long as he could. When the Ostland prince at last breathed his last ragged breath, justice and vengeance was at last exacted. Having accomplished what he had set out to do, and with little desire to play out the role the gods had decreed for him, Mortkin threw down his axe and lifted his great helm from his bearded head.
"Wergild is paid," he bellowed. "Let Volganov burn to repay my home of Ulfanek. Never again shall I return there. My saga is ended, and I chose now to die as a man. My will, my own. I go now, perhaps too late, to the halls of my fathers."
With this proclamation, the fell light died out around Mortkin, the bitter gods perhaps taking back that which they had given. The Crimson Reapers, his personal guard, bore witness to their beloved Jarl falling under the vengeful halberds of the Scarlet Curse, the Ostland regiment serving Vasily von Raukov, brother to the felled Oleg. Mad with grief, the reapers slaughtered the cursed to a man, and carried the body of their liege lord within the now burning city, set alight by the victorious looting and pillaging of Mortkin's army. Amidst the fire and flames, they formed a protective wall around their king, slaughtering any who dared to approach, as they mourned him with furious shedding of blood and anguished howls of sorrow, even going so far as to slay fellow Norsemen who accused them of cowardice. Though the horde of Mortkin had later been driven back to the north by the timely arrival of the Reichsguard and the returned Valmir von Raukov, their victory had been hollow and Pyrrhic. For Ostland had been ravaged, her sons lay dead in their thousands, and her mightiest cities now a flaming ruin. A funeral pyre for a fallen king, a fire so mighty as to reach up and blind the gods themselves. A fitting end to the saga of Lord Mortkin of NORSCA.